I was discussing creepypastas with my grandfather. He had never heard of the term before and kind of snickered at it. After I explained to him what they were, he said, "We used to just call them urban legends." He wanted some examples, and I gave him a few of the obvious ones: Slenderman, Bandrown, etc. I then told him about one I'd recently read, a story called The Milk Boy. It took place in the 1800s and dealt with a young boy who was lured into the woods by men who were long dead. Then he stumbles upon a marble that shelters the dead man's soul. After the boy loses the marble, he becomes obsessed with finding it, eventually murdering everyone in his town. But the marble was gone. The boy failed to recover it, and it alluded to that he will keep killing until he finds it. I was surprised by my grandfather's reaction after I told him that. He clammed up and became really awkward. I asked him if he was okay, and he only nodded. He then seemed to get weak and lost his balance. I assumed it was just the vertigo he was suffering from. My grandmother took him home after that to rest. A week later, my parents and I dropped off some groceries to my grandparents' house. I was a little anxious to see my grandfather since I hadn't spoken to him since the day he had his spell. We went inside and he was in his recliner watching an old black and white Western movie. He seemed fine. He smiled and gave me a hug, and I walked over to him. My mom and grandmother were in the kitchen talking and putting away the groceries. That left just me and my dad and my grandfather in the living room. The Western movie was still on, and none of us were saying anything. I fiddled with my phone. My dad was zoned out, and my grandfather was glued to his movie. Eventually, my grandfather finally spoke up and talked about his car's check engine light had been on. I thought it was a little odd. That was the first thing he started talking about, and out of nowhere, really. But he knew my dad worked on cars. My dad seemed to jump at the chance to escape the awkward silence, and he went to the garage to take a look at the old car. My grandfather immediately muted the television after that. He looked over at me as I sat on the couch. He swallowed hard and said, "They were devils." I became extremely anxious right away. I didn't know what he was talking about, and everything now seemed a little creepy. I questioned him, and he repeated the same three words. "They were devils." "Who?" I asked. "The long dead men in the woods, from that story you told me about." I knew what he was referring to. The Milk Boy, the story I told him about before he had his vertigo spell a week earlier. It turned out my grandfather had been told a similar story by his father. As he began to tell me the story, for some reason my instinct was to hit record on the voice memo feature on my phone. Here's what I was able to transcribe from his recording. "When I was little, we lived in New England. It's such a beautiful place. So what I saw and heard seemed very out of place. It was a summer night, a day or two before my 10th birthday. I couldn't sleep. The sun hadn't gone down yet, and I still had energy built up from the day. So I went to the window and opened it up. I sat there for almost 45 minutes and watched the sun dip down behind the mountains. When the dark came, I still wasn't tired, so I continued to sit there. I saw raccoons scamper out of the woods and sniff around the trash cans by the garage. I saw bats flying above the trees. They were all normal sights for a living where we did. Then, just as I started to get tired, I heard some more rustling from the woods behind our house. I assumed it was just another raccoon at first. The moon seemed brighter that night than usual, so everything out my window was illuminated by the moon's glow. I saw something dark moving just within the trees, and then it stopped. It moved again and then stopped. I shook out my fatigue and tried to focus on whatever was moving in the woods. A long shadow then extended from within the trees. It grew long and then disappeared just as fast. The shadow did this again, and then a second shadow joined it. As the shadow stretched across the yard, they reached the trash cans. The trash cans moved as the shadows made contact with them, and one of the metal lids crashed to the ground. That's when I realized they weren't shadows at all. I gasped loudly, and the dark appendages retracted quickly back into the woods like they were scared. As soon as they were out of sight, a horrible, dry howl emerged from the darkness. It shattered my nerves, and I fell backwards. I rushed to my bed, tossed the covers over my head. I could still hear the howl, but it had faded, like whatever it was now retreating in the opposite direction. I felt dizzy after that. Never have experienced such a bizarre moment. I passed out and didn't wake up until the morning. When I woke up, the first thing I did was go to my window. It was still open, and now a musty smell had come through it overnight. It was foggy outside, so I blamed the fog on the odd scent. The trash cans were still there, and one of the lids was still on the ground. At breakfast, I told my father what I had seen. He didn't say a lot at first, other than I shouldn't have been awake out of the bed at the time. But a little later, and the day after the fog had burned away, I was outside with him, helping him carry firewood to the other side of the house. He picked up the metal lid and put it back onto the trash can. He looked out into the vast sea of wilderness that surrounded our little house and told me to come closer. When I did, he pointed to the woods. "Is that where you saw it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He then told me a bizarre story that both scared me and scarred me. About 100 years earlier, there was a family of 4 who lived in our house. There was a sickness that was going around, a virus that made my father ill. He died within days of contracting it. That left only the mother to take care of her 2 children, a boy and a girl. The mother went to work every day, sometimes not coming home up to 8 or 9 hours. That left the boy to care for his little sister. At 10 years old, he was the eldest of the 2 children. He would fix meals for his sister, play with her, help teach her things. One afternoon for lunch, the boy had poured his sister a glass of milk. The milk had gone bad, but he didn't know it. The girl drank it and screamed at the foulness of it. She immediately fell ill, violently throwing up and breaking out into a high fever. The boy panicked and said he would go to get help. The closest neighbor was roughly a mile away, but the boy knew it wouldn't get out through the woods. He could save himself about a quarter of a mile. He got his sister comfortable in her bed, wet rag on her head, and he took off to the woods. He ran and ran, but the woods seemed different to him. They seemed contorted, or even backwards. The boy stopped when he realized he was lost. That's when he heard a voice. It was a deep voice, almost inhuman. He looked around, but he didn't see anyone. He called out, and then the voice came again. He was yelling, "He'll be in the 6th." The boy turned around, and this time what he saw made his blood run cold. There was a small group of trees that stood in front of him, each with human remains tied to them. The boy gagged as the overwhelming stench of decay overpowered his senses. The boy heard the voice again. This time, it asked who he was. "Doyle," the boy responded, still unsure of where the voices were coming from. The voice spoke again in a different language. Doyle didn't understand the words he was hearing, but started to hallucinate and see things in front of him. The trees were bare, and a mob of villagers from somewhere were dragging 5 naked men through the woods. They had the 5 men bound and gagged, but the men didn't seem to be putting up a fight. It was almost like they had accepted their fate, or even wanted it. Doyle watched as the villagers tied the 5 men to the trees and condemned them to die for their dark practices, calling them each a devil. One of the villagers had a long blade of some kind, and then systematically went through all 5 men, slicing them open from head to toe. As the bodies all hung there, spilling their blood onto the dirt below, the villagers claimed to have all heard ghostly laughter that they assumed came from the dead men. The bodies were left there to rot, and are said to be in the woods somewhere to this day. Doyle was reported missing that night when his mother came home to find him gone, and his sister dead in her bed. The official story of what happened to Doyle is unclear, but it is heavily assumed that the 5 devils had chained him into the 6th. One more ghastly and repellent than they were, one which unnaturally crawls through the woods, discharging a grim howl and committing vile acts ordered by the 5 devils. I turned the voice recorder off after that. As my grandfather told me this story, I could see the similarities between it and the Milk Boy. Both stories took place in New England area dealt with similar themes, as well as included the boy named Doyle. My grandfather remained convinced to this day that the shadowy appendages of what he saw coming from the woods that summer night was the more ghastly iteration of Doyle. He said what he saw was real, and combined with the story of his father told him, there was no other explanation for what he witnessed. I can't imagine something like that even being real, but now there seems to be multiple versions of the same story. As I looked deeper into the creepypasta story, I realized it was a part of a large story called The Wool, which deals with a supernatural entity designed by the Milk Boy legend, violently mutilating people in the towns who emit a dry howl cry. Now I am convinced that maybe there is more stories out there like that. Maybe other people have heard a terrible cry from deep within the woods in New England. Maybe others have smelled the unexplainable foul odor. Whether or not the story is real, my grandfather has never lied to me. I believe him. The fear he feels to this day is undeniably real.